I want to start today's talk off with an experiment. Congratulations, you are the winner of the first ever Trav Talks entry list contest. You have two choices for how you can redeem your prize. Option 1, a guaranteed payout of $900, or option 2, a 90% chance of $1,000 and a 10% chance of nothing. While you make your decision, set that aside for now, and there's a second part. Unfortunately, you've just been selected for a mandatory fine. The good news is you have some choice in how the fine is applied to you. The first option is a guaranteed $900 fine. The second option is a 90% chance of a $1,000 fine and a 10% chance of nothing. All right, recall your answers to both questions and let's dive in. First off, there's no right or wrong answer to either of those questions. Instead, the way you selected your answers is going to tell us something about decision making, rationality, and risk tolerance. You see, the expected value of each of those scenarios was exactly the same. Expected value is a way to calculate probable return based on the outcome times the probability. So, $900 at a 100% chance is an expected return of $900. And $1,000 at a 90% chance is 1,000 times 0.9 is also $900. So mathematically, logically, rationally, they're the exact same choice. Before we get into interpretation and application, I want to guess what your answers were. In the first situation, I'm guessing you took the guaranteed $900. Relatively speaking, $1,000 isn't all that much more than $900. And while the 10% chance of striking out is pretty low, materially speaking, everything you can do with $1,000, you can pretty much do with $900. So why take the chance? For the second question, however, I'm betting that far more of you took the dice roll on losing $1,000 rather than the guarantee of $900. Mathematically speaking, it's exactly the same proposition, but didn't it feel significantly different? When we're talking about a loss rather than a gain, that 10% sliver of hope of getting out of the $900 or $1,000 bill starts to sound really appealing when we're talking about a loss. But when we're talking about a gain, not so much. Now, there are some of you who surely bucked that trend. I'm sure that someone watching this took the guarantee in both scenarios or the gamble in both scenarios. I'm sure that most of us took the guarantee on the gain and the gamble on the loss. But I bet that very, very few of us took the gamble for the gain and the guarantee for the loss. Regardless, the research done and reported on by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, in his work Thinking Fast and Slow, assures us that, yes indeed, most people take the guarantee on the gain and the gamble on the loss. Why is that? And more pertinently, okay Travis, that's really interesting, but what the heck does that have to do with law and order per the title? Some of you that know me particularly well, or maybe you're just very astute, probably already know where I'm going with this. But before we get to there, I have one more exercise for us to do. In the third scenario, I ask you, how much would you pay for a ticket that granted you access to that first gamble? In other words, how much would you pay for the right to roll the dice with a 90% chance of a $1,000 gain or a 10% chance of bust? Again, I'm going to guess that the vast majority of answers were somewhere between $100 and $500. Certainly there are outliers, but I'm guessing that there's a good clustering in there, especially maybe around the $250 to $300 range. Again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but your answer tells you something about your personal levels of risk sensitivity and loss aversion. The way Daniel Kahneman describes this as, when directly compared or weighted against each other, losses loom larger than gains. The amount you were willing to gamble in that third scenario tells you a very precise measure of how sensitive or tolerant you are to risk. You see, mathematically speaking, you could go up to $899 for that ticket and you would still be rationally correct, given what we said earlier, that the expected return is $900, Someone who's a Vegas professional gambler would say, good bet, up to $899. But for most people, there's an emotional component to this decision, because we are humans, not robots. For most people, losses are weighted about twice as heavily as an equivalent gain. Hence my prediction of the $450 or so target for most people. You see, if the expected return is $900 on this gamble, and most people have a risk sensitivity of 2 to 1, then $450 is the price they would rationally pay for a 200% return on risk. Some people are much more sensitive to risk. Maybe your price for that ticket was $100, and you've got an internal risk sensitivity of 9 to 1. In other words, you would need a 900% payoff to take a risk of this nature. Maybe some of you were even more sensitive than that, and certainly some were less. All of these scenarios are fun and interesting, but they tell us two important things. Number one, we weight losses more heavily than we weight gains. And number two, when all options are bad, we become more risk-seeking. If you took the gamble in the loss scenario, that's true of you. Remember that. But now let's switch gears to the main point of this video. There's a lot of discussion going on right now about policing, and let's set that aside for the moment. Let's just be very simple and objective. The fundamental problem with police practice is that it is intrinsically reactive rather than proactive. We can have a long conversation about what should constitute just and probable cause, but effectively we all recognize that police can't do anything until a crime is in progress or already complete. Otherwise we get into a Minority Report situation where we have to ask ourselves, is it just to detain someone for a crime that they have not yet committed, even if we can calculate with near certainty that they're eventually going to commit that crime? I'll let Tom Cruise answer that question, but for now, we live in a world where all police can do is react and either mitigate the damage that's being caused by crime or punish it after the fact. So, law and order. I posit that the best way to deal with crime is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Not to make any moral judgments or statements on the value of policing as a practice, but we should all want police officers to be bored. Especially if you or a family member are in law enforcement. Because less crime may make them bored, but it also means less risk, less danger for you or your family members. For everyone else, this is a generic social problem. But for you, it's personal. The question becomes then, how do we best prevent crime? And to make a very complex question seem very simple, I'll give the economic answer. You change the incentives. Crime is inherently irrational. Most people who commit crimes are not thinking 10 steps ahead on some grand four-dimensional chessboard. Your average criminal is not George Clooney as Daniel Ocean in Ocean's 11. They're probably either an opportunist or desperate, and they'll commit a crime if it is easy to do so right in front of them, or because they feel like they have no other option. Wherever you are on the political or social spectrum, you probably recognize that poverty is highly correlated with crime, so I probably don't have to prove that correlation to you. But just in case, and to make it more interesting, I want to read some statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Persons in poor households at or below the federal poverty level, heretofore FPL, had more than double the rate of violent victimization as persons in high-income households. In other words, if you are poor, you are twice as likely to be a victim of crime. Second, persons in poor households had a higher rate of violence involving a firearm compared to persons above the poverty level. Third, poor persons living in urban areas, 43.9 per 1,000, had violent victimization rates similar to poor persons living in rural areas, 38.8 per 1,000, and poor urban blacks, 51.3 per 1,000, had rates of violence similar to poor urban whites, 56.4 per 1,000. In other words, poverty is associated with both criminal activity and victimization across races and across cultural settings, urban versus rural, for instance. As for value, the average property theft is in the amount of about $1,400. Even a bank robbery average is about $3,500. So yes, crime is irrational, and we all know that crime doesn't pay. But, recalling our lessons from earlier, we proved that we all become increasingly irrational when all of the possible outcomes are bad. Let's do this again, but let's crank up the intensity from our earlier exercise. Here again, we're going to lose money. Option 1, you are guaranteed to lose $900,000. Option 2, you have a 99% chance to lose $1 million, or a 1% chance of getting off scot-free. Here, unlike before, these options are not mathematically equivalent. Rationally speaking, you're better off taking the guaranteed hit of $900,000. But to be crass, with $900,000, you're screwed either way. For the vast majority of the population, $900,000 or $1 million is a life-ruining event. So what's another $100K if you have even the tiniest sliver of a hope of getting away free? And you made this decision while sitting comfortably in front of your computer sipping coffee, or while vegging out on your comfortable couch looking at your smartphone. Imagine making this decision instead after watching your child miss a meal, after seeing them slowly start to get skinnier rather than grow, after an incarceration of a family member, another job loss, another rejected application. Now, I'm not here to pitch specific policy proposals or solutions. I leave that to the economists and experts. But I do want to get across the simple idea that if law and order is an important thing for you, it's time to consider strengthening of these social safety nets rather than gutting them. And it's time to consider that maybe increasing the consequences or the severity of punishment is not going to have the desired effect. Why? Because a significant amount of crime is committed because all of the options are bad already. Making one slightly worse doesn't really change the value proposition. If the status quo is being evicted from your home, your child not being able to find their next meal, or your entire family living in crippling poverty with no prospect of improvement, then your risk tolerance will be extremely high. If your options are get evicted and become homeless, 99% chance that you rob a bank and are put in jail where you are housed and clothed and fed, and 1% chance that you rob a bank and get away with $3,500 and can maybe save your family for another 2 months, then the risky bit doesn't seem quite as bad. But we can change this by changing the incentives. And if this scenario seems too far-fetched, and you, like me, have layers of contingency and security before you would ever have to consider something as dire or direct as robbing a bank, well, there's a term for that. It's called privilege. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's not even necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I'm grateful for my privilege. I'm thankful that if something dire happened to my finances, I could move in with one of my many grandparents who have a gigantic paid-for house, and we could not have to risk being on the street. But we have to understand that not everybody is as lucky as we are, and we have to remember that when we are making proposals or voting for local, state, or federal policies. Remember, the other side of loss aversion is that people are less likely to take risks, like criminal activity, if they have something to protect. In other words, if people have something to lose, they are less likely to engage in risky behavior. Just like before, we all became more conservative and more risk-averse when the options were both good rather than bad. To vastly oversimplify, we should promote programs that give people something to protect. Gainful employment, reasonable housing, food security, a chance at education, access to health care. There are two main arguments that I tend to come across when we talk about expanding the social safety nets in this way. First are the people who make a moralistic or dogmatic argument that basically says people who commit crimes do so because they're already inherently bad people. And if we give money to or support to these people, that we're just rewarding them for their lazy or destructive behaviors. Essentially, it's a question of cause and effect. Does poverty make people make bad choices? Or do people make bad choices that lead to poverty? In the scope of this video, I'm not going to be able to convince you to flip your assumptions. But I will request that you think about this. In the exercises from earlier, they probably saw you, a good, well-meaning, honest person, become much more risk-tolerant or risk-seeking when all of the options were bad. Ponder on that the next time you think, they're just a bad person. Possibly, but possibly they're in a no-win scenario when They're taking risks because that's the best option out of a set of all bad options, and that their character is really no different than anyone else who values survival. The second type are those who genuinely believe that their hard work should not go to other people. Why should I work hard to reward somebody who doesn't work? Setting aside the entire earlier discussion on circumstances and privilege, the fact of the matter is, even if you're a staunch individualist, you live in a society with other people. And having a society with fewer people who are desperate, risk-seeking, and risk-tolerant is not just altruistic or having a bleeding heart. It's good for you, too. And even if you aren't directly affected by crime, there are secondary ramifications and ancillary deleterious effects. Your taxes already pay for policing and social programs, and even if they didn't, crime affects the communities where we work, live, and play. We can have a long conversation about the value proposition, but in almost every case that I have ever seen directly or in a study, it is so much better to prevent the damage than to seek remedial options. Your tax dollars are better spent on programs to reduce poverty and desperation than they are on strengthening programs like policing, sentencing, or housing people who have already committed a crime. And by the way, I have no illusions that even practical and well-designed and cost-effective programs will be a silver bullet that will completely eliminate all crime and grant us some sort of utopia. But I will stand by the position that crime could be greatly reduced at the source by bringing more people into a healthy status quo. We've constructed a false narrative that once someone even thinks about doing something bad, they're a bad person, and the only thing that we can do is ostracize them, put them at arm's length, detain them, maybe crack a few skulls too, and that'll really help things out. That approach has proven itself wrong time and time again. The failed war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strike laws, and even right now, the protests over racial inequality, which, by the way, have almost certainly been amplified by the economic uncertainty of COVID-19. Strengthening social programs to lessen desperation and need isn't just the right thing to do. It pays massive dividends, directly and indirectly. You want to protect the boys in blue? You want more law and order? Give people something to protect, and they will want law and order just as much as you.